Hello and welcome to the J plus R movie podcast. Today we will be discussing two films called Dead of Night. One that came out in 1977 and is a set of three shorts combined together, and another one that is also an anthology film comprised of a series of shorts with a wraparound segment, but that was made in 1945. We'll start on the 70s one. This one is basically it's a series of it's three shorts that aren't connected and are kind of each standalone, but they're all kind of essentially horror themed. So one of them is about a man who gets transported back in time through a car. Another one is set in the olden times, and it's about a guy who's suspicious of a vampire that has bitten his wife. And then the third one is about a mother who has brought her son back from the dead, but then bad stuff happens related to that.
I really liked this one. Had a couple decent twists on the horror genre. The second story especially stood out to me.
Although I found the budget to be a bit obvious because it didn't feel necessarily cinematic, I do feel like for like a TV movie that was made all the way back then, it was actually well directed. I felt I didn't think that there were any like noticeably bad flubs or anything that was noticeably cheap. It was just more very small, particularly the second two stories that largely just take place in a house.
I think the only story where it was an issue for me was the first one, just because it almost felt too small for what it was trying to be.
You expect there to be a bit more to it than what they show, but it is a fairly brief story.
I felt that there wasn't much to that first story in terms of horror. It struck me more like an episode of The Twilight Zone than it did of, but like a bad episode of The Twilight Zone. Like because it wasn't bad, but I wouldn't say that part of the film was particularly great either. It was weird, which was nice.
Or it was more like an episode of The Twilight Zone that wouldn't necessarily be scary, but would more just be interesting.
The second two are the ones that I found the most arresting. I think my favourite was the second because it does use the vampire tropes really, really well and really sets it up to seem like that's what's going on. So when you get to the end of it, you realise that the way that I read it anyway is that the wife had an affair with this guy, so the husband basically drugged her to make her ill, concocted a vampire story, and got his mate to murder the jealous lover, basically. It's one of those monstrous man stories, but one that kind of takes it away from, instead of the, oh my god, the man's such a horrific murderer, it turns it like the horror of emotion and intellect in one horrible mix, and that was quite interesting.
Yeah, intellect because he's smart enough to cook up this scheme, basically get rid of the person who's been cuckolding him. And there's a scenario, it does kind of play with your expectations, but I do feel like all the whole time you are waiting for the vampire to actually show itself, but then you realise there is no vampire. Once the guy keels over, you realise, oh wait, he's been drugged, and then you see the blood being put in his mouth and then him being put in the crypt, and then you fully figure out from there that the entire thing was just made up. And that is scary, and it's kind of a horror story that I don't think is that common. Hint at the supernatural, then just reveal like, oh no, it was just made up by some guy.
I find a lot of those stories also just don't work, but this one really did because it knew the situation. I think it really pushed that and made it an emotionally understandable thing, which makes it all the more horrifying.
Well, it's emotionally understandable in the sense that you can sort of understand his like jealousy, and also understand that he wouldn't want to deliberately just straight up go after this guy. Instead, you just want to take him out, and you want to take him out under seemingly like noble pretenses as well, particularly given the setting of the 1700s.
That was definitely the 1800s.
I do have a criticism overall of the film. It's that there's not really a wraparound segment apart from this narration that you hear at the beginning. And each of the stories do feel very, very different to each other. And I feel like maybe a bit more of a connection or more of a through line between all of them would have given it a bit more of a sense of flow, because it does feel like we're seeing this story and now it's this story and then it's this story and then it just kind of ends.
I think there was a through line with each of them. The story seemed like it was going to go one way and then went a complete another. I almost had a theme of reversals each time. You thought the horror of the first story was that he was stranded in the 20s. Like, you feel like that's going to be the horror of the story. The story is obviously he gets that car from his girlfriend's dad when he moves on. You just see that the night that's basically screwed his life up, then absolutely nothing.
The twist that everything actually works out and it turns out to be not a time loop, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It was always going to happen and they were always going to find it. It was a really, really interesting thing to see happen, actually.
And then there's the obvious subversion of the second story that we pointed out. And then there's the third storyline, which, well, that did kind of have the subversion, and that being the fact that the mother is seemingly implied to have not been a very good mother, which does throw you off because her desire to like resurrect her kid and her behavior with her son Bobby, like her major defining trait.
That also makes absolute sense. She did still love her kid, but her actions caused her kid to die. The guilt response of that, or she'd almost want the do-over. It's like the stories had a theme of resetting things to how they should be.
I guess that is a good like through line that each of the stories have. It does make them each individually worth watching, and even like worth watching again, knowing what you know at the end of each story.
It's a different experience when you go through it the second time.
Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of overall makes it worthwhile as a film, despite that sort of lack of like cohesion. And I think that the film does also benefit from the fact that each of the stories are so different because you're not just getting the same thing over and over again.
It almost reminds you when they used to show B movies, like B short films before the big ones in cinema. It's like if you stuck three of them together and made that the main feature. Sometimes people would go to the cinema for those B films anyway. So when you got them in a string, it's almost like, you get to get these almost slices of life that weren't really well connected, but produce the same emotional effect, which is interesting. Because I think the way that film's structured actually makes me realise that I personally don't actually need things to be linked by a theme, as long as they're linked by a feeling. I think that might actually be the more important link.
Well, with the opening, they like that first little bit of narration does kind of say, "Oh, Dead of Night doesn't refer to time; it refers to a feeling," and you could say that that's kind of replicated in the fact that each of the shorts, both, I wouldn't say that they have the same like emotional quality, but I would say that they have the same thing of the world not being correct. You could say, like the world being.
They all produce a very subtle kind of disconcerting horror, which I really love. Everything's off balance, and that's the scary part. It's not that they're trying to outright scare you with a big bang or a big monster or anything like that. They're quietly scaring you at your core rather than scaring as in like producing the immediate response per se. It's more like a slow burn kind of scare.
I mean, even the first story, although it has an optimistic outcome, it's still the kind of situation that would be unsettling to begin with, even if it had that good outcome. You'd still think, and he still ends it not knowing how this time traveling took place or anything. He'd probably go through the rest of his life not knowing if something like that would happen again. I mean, we don't even know if each of these storylines take place in the same world.
Yeah, I think each of the stories had that really nice, concerning horror quality to them, and for me, that's quite rewatchable because that's unique in the genre as well. You usually don't get it. I kind of like having it.
A little bit more stuff on like the direction as well. I think it improves as the stories go on. I think that the first one is probably the weakest in terms of direction because the one that feels the most like dated in terms of its style, and there weren't really any interesting flourishes, I felt. And the reason why I call it dated, the visual quality of it, heavy overlighting, and then the heavy like underlighting of the scene when it goes into the past at night, as well as the narration itself, does make it feel a lot more old.
The lighting itself was quite flat, which was quite a common thing in TV at the time.
It just looked old, is kind of how I put it. But as it goes forward, it gets a lot better in terms of its style. And I think that the third bit is definitely the best one because it's the one that's the scariest. It's the most.
You got those lovely flashes of light, like through the windows. The sound design was just great because you had that creepy child singing and the way it came through the phone, the constantly going, "That's not where I am." I mean, things like that was just like, oh god.
It was a scary scenario because basically the kid comes back and then tries to convince the mother to play like hide and seek, and then forces her to play hide and seek. And then like it basically becomes like a scenario where she's trying to like get out of the house and also like defeat him. And it basically has this sense of tension, extreme tension, fear, terror as well. And all of that is just created mainly through moody lighting, but also through the direction as well. It definitely comes to life quite a lot in that sequence.
The fact that the perspective is from the mother. It's not quite. It's almost a POV shot on the stairs when the boy's coming down. That really gets to you. It feels like a much more directed kind of moment of assault, and you really emotionally connect you with the mother while you're also judging her based on what's being said, which is really interesting. So you kind of get this equal part of, oh my god, this is horrific, but also kind of get the sneaking thought in the back of your head, like, she kind of deserves it though.
She's being punished, and she's also being punished for like bringing her son back, using this like witchcraft stuff. It did really remind me of like Pet Sematary, kind of like Pet Sematary if it was the mother doing it instead. But at the same time, though, I think it was like scary enough that that didn't get in the way too much. It's fairly short as well. It's only like 74 minutes. I didn't think it really dragged. There were a couple of bits in the final story where I thought it was going to end sooner than it did, but that's just sort of a typical thing in horror, isn't it? You know, you have like the moment where you think the monster is defeated, but then they come back. I don't think each storyline like outstayed their welcome. I thought that they were fairly tight. I do feel like the second story could have had a little bit more to it, maybe more of an establishment that the wife was like actually having the affair. That's not really made that clear.
You know what? I don't think that needed to be established because it's not 100% that she did have the affair.
So you think it's more that he just was suspecting it? I didn't necessarily pick up that ambiguity, but I did kind of notice that they were being a little bit coy on revealing more than what we were just already seeing. I just sort of took it that like that's what was going on. But yeah, you are right that there is a sense of ambiguity to it. Overall, I'd say it's worth a watch. It's a very easy, breezy watch, but also very dark and, you know, scary on quite a few different levels.
Ultimately, it works well as one cohesive piece. You could have them separately, but it's kind of nice to see them one after another. Because they are so different, your brain can always get shocked again and again by each one, which is really cool. So this one's really worth the watch. People, check it out. It's not a bad way to kill less than an hour and a half.
So let's go on to Dead of Night 1945, another anthology. This time it's a wraparound, that being a man who visits a house that has a lot of guests in it. He's going there because he wants to discuss a set of dreams that he's had that all involve each of these guests and kind of tells these different stories. And we're seeing mainly the verbal sparring that's going on between him and this German psychologist called Dr. Van Straten, who's basically disbelieving him. We're also visually seeing these stories that he's telling. They're all based on dreams that he's had. And that's kind of how it goes. And then at the end, we get a reveal that sort of ties it together. What did you think of this one?
It was really, really good. I liked the wraparound was there because it kind of looked quite creepy. I mean, the ending was a bit The It's a Dream thing, basically. I don't like the It's a Dream thing that comes up. I just find that kind of dumb. I know that the ending then implies like it's going to happen, but it was a lot more effective to just leave it. It was interesting seeing him move through those dreams.
You would rather that it just ended there?
Still got the wraparound story, but it doesn't seem like a constant loop, and I think that might have been a bit more of an interesting thing.
I thought it was a very clever reveal, but, you know, I will admit that probably would have played a bit better back in the 40s when that kind of twist was still somewhat original, you know? Because nowadays it is a bit overdone, I will admit. I don't find it to be that original, but I did find it to be clever. I enjoyed it more than I was expecting, and I think part of the reason why is just because it wasn't kind of traditional in terms of horror. It was all existential horror. I would say every story was based, for the most part, within the mind. Obviously, with the final reveal, it's based in the mind as well. But if you take that aside, all of the different stories are kind of all about somebody's mind being messed with. That I found to be a very, very interesting hook that connected each story and also made all of them chilling to me, apart from the one that was more like played for laughs. But aside from that one, all of the other ones were mostly just played for horror, and I thought that all of them were very effective.
I did find the stories effective. I like, the idea it was people's mind just sort of disintegrating a bit.
It was partially because of the influence of something else. Like, in the first one, it was basically like a premonition that he received through a dream. In the second one, it was like a ghost haunting. In the third one, it was like a haunted mirror, and then in the puppet storyline, it ended up being split personality. So sometimes there was an outside influence and sometimes it was just purely within the mind. But all of these instances, it all felt like there was something that was causing this like breakdown. And that kind of contrasted well with the fairly upclass Britishness of the entire production and also of like the acting and the environments and the settings as well. There was this sort of upper class professional British like quality to it. But you also had this sense of like madness going on as well, this sort of unraveling nature to it.
Especially as you looked at that, there were quite a lot of themes of asylums, and in the second story, the hide and seek, that almost looked like some weird hybrid of Metropolis Surprise-esque thing. And then obviously when you got Craig running through them all at the end, you got to see how demented the situation looks from outside.
Because some of them seem normal and then they just pull this twist and ultimately like reveal the story to be a horror story. Like I would say each of them start out normally and then as they go on progressively get more and more scary. And I think that some of them are like scarier than others. I think that the best ones are the mirror story and the puppet story. I think those are the standouts by far. As a result of that, the film, I do feel like it does take a while to like get going. The first two like story bits are good, but I think that it really picks up with the mirror story. Well, the very first one, it's a bit brief. It's only like 5 minutes, but I mean, it's interesting, but it is brief. The second storyline, I mean, it is scary, but it's also a bit familiar just because, you know, I've seen so many like haunted house movies.
It was creepy, but it wasn't scary.
In the mirror story, you were getting, again, unraveling of this man's psyche through this cursed mirror. And it's a very, very scary process to watch unfold. It's a really good relationship that we see with him and his wife, and how we see that relationship kind of disintegrate. And then we have, like, you know, the ending where he basically attempts to kill his wife, and his wife thankfully saves the two of them by just smashing the mirror. That one and the puppet storyline as well would arguably make for like good movies on their own, I feel. But I think they work effectively too, just as shorts.
Oh, they do really strike at the heart of upper class fears, each of them. You know, fear of death, you've got that fear of the childhood party, and there was the social fear, and that. And the fear of your own reflection, quite interesting, because it's almost like, you know, guy gets lost in his own shadow, like shadow self, like the inner reflected self, because the kind of background of him is completely changes, but then he always ends up with someone else entirely, and he comes to just strangle her immediately.
Being possessed by like the past owner of the mirror, who in the past did kill his wife. So they're all like made by different directors. You can't really tell because visually speaking, there's not a big difference between each of them. I will say that there is a bit of a tonal difference between each of them.
For example, the fourth dream is actually sort of comedic.
It's almost fully comedic, but not quite.
Still horror elements, but it's almost kind of funny. It's almost like a relationship comedy where there's an extra third person. It's almost like the ultimate third wheeling comedy, but done in a horror style, because the third wheel's ghost that he can never get rid of no matter what he does. And he's again partially there's something in his mind because he can't get through the thing that he needs to get through to do it. You know, the final story is just really dark. I feel like this inspired, you know, Scarface from Batman.
Yeah, Batman. Yeah.
It really reminds me of the ventriloquist in Scarface.
Right.
It's a little bit psycho-y, to be fair.
It's this personality twist. So yeah,
exactly. It's the personality twist. And I think it was, you know, it was just as effective here as it was. Well, I suppose this must have been like a progenitor for it, really. So, you know,
yeah, somewhat. Yeah,
those sort of themes that you kind of get in there. The dream, the first one again, Twilight Zone-esque.
Or even Final Destination, like indirectly he saves himself by like because he has a premonition of the thing that's going to happen. You know, it's kind of an indirect but example of that kind of story.
I think because it was so totally different, you got this. You were at first going, okay, these are unconnected little stories. They're interesting. You know, it's anthology. I think that when they were connected at the end, as the delusions of one guy's imaginary mind, that was interesting.
I'd say that sequence was probably the scariest one in the movie because it was just so crazy and off the wall, but it was also a nightmare going into like overdrive, and it made for what I felt to be a really good climax, you know, to the story overall. And each of these different like storylines as well, they kind of each have this like sense of build up and progression to them that then come to a head in a satisfying payoff. They start out normal and then they end in a sort of like big moment, you know, whether it be the bus crash in the first one, the reveal of the ghost boy in the second one, the husband trying to kill the wife in the third one. Each of them have this solid like payoff, and that helps. It helps each story feel worthwhile as well, because each of them give you with something that's feeling, you know, and they leave you, I don't know if I'd say like satisfied, but I think that what they do is that they kind of create this feeling of, wow, that's a scary scenario. And then in the wraparound storylines, you think to yourself, okay, well, how is this like connected? What is the significance of one story in relation to the other story? What's the significance of this story in relation to this guy? Throughout the bits where it's cutting back to Walter Craig in the room and you're getting these debates between him and the psychologist, you are kind of thinking to yourself, well, is the stuff that Walter Craig is saying, is it just nonsense, or is he genuinely predicting what is going to happen? One of the things that he does predict ends up happening. He ends up killing the psychologist.
I got the idea that all these little fantasies he was having was putting the pressure on his head like that. And it was almost like the horror inside the normal man, and that was really, it was interesting to move through his dreamscape and then see how he was almost like moving through the levels, almost like the psychological build-up to him killing the guy without anyone realizing it, which I thought was really cool.
It prevents the wraparound bits from feeling too much like time filler or feeling too much like they're just interrupting more interesting things that are happening. But I'll admit that they aren't as interesting as like the rest of the storylines. They are still interesting. And I think it's well, like, the dialogue is at its most like engaging, I think, is because these characters are just openly analyzing what's going on and they're trying to figure it out. There's also kind of, again, this like Julian perspective. I mean, the guests are kind of agreeing with it, but they're kind of also not. They're sort of outsiders. And again, it is purely between Walter and the psychologist. That makes for an engaging psychological battle as well.
Yeah, it sort of settles you in that kind of moment, and it gives a sense of unpredictability to events, which I found to really reinforce that almost uncomfortable feeling that the stories kind of give you.
And as for any flaws, I did find the film to be a bit too long. It's only an hour and 40 minutes, but I do think that the pacing is slow.
I honestly feel like you could cut the fourth story and not lose too much.
And the film does seem to kind of acknowledge it because it's not really even part of one of the dreams that he's having. It's more just a story that he tells.
And he doesn't really end up moving through it.
That is true. I don't think it gets a callback at the end. That's the only one that feels almost purposely like filler. It almost feels like just a bit of like light relief from the horror of the third story and the fifth story. Could cut that. I think it works fine as like a bit of almost not comic relief, something to maybe alleviate the tension of the third story, because the third story is so intense that I like having this story that comes right after it that is lighter. But plot-wise, yeah, you could definitely remove it. And some of the stories are a bit longer than others. Like the first two stories aren't that long, but the third storyline is, I think it's about like 20 minutes long. And you do sort of feel the length of that one, and even of the puppet one as well, because that's longer. That's like 25 minutes.
The fourth one didn't work so well because it wasn't too far off the length of one that was a lot more interesting. Like 15 minutes. If you could give him maybe a little bit more time to, I'd say that given a little bit more time to the second and the third one, to make them the exact same length as, or a similar length to the one with the doll, could have been quite interesting.
Even like, the wraparound segments, it is basically just a bunch of people standing in a room talking. And it makes up for that by giving them interesting things to say. The third and fifth stories that really like raise the quality of the film to me. It's a very well made film. It's got this gothic quality without being like overtly gothic.
You've got the bleaker, emotion driven output. You've got those heavily shadowed. You've got the stately manners as the settings. You've got that kind of contrast between polite society and the inner workings of the mind.
The direction in general does manage to be somewhat restrained in its camera work, but still get across this feeling of like mental instability that you're seeing in like a lot of these characters. I think it definitely comes to life the most in that ending dream sequence, where it's going very, very crazy in terms of its like visuals. It's definitely a movie of the 40s, but I think that it also does manage to like bring itself to life when it needs to.
It feels almost like a lot of British films in the 40s did, where it was almost like a film stage play, but had those elements that did leap out really well. Like I'd say its use of shadow, especially in the puppet sequences, were really nice. I think it used sound pretty well. I would say this one's quite worth the watch. I wouldn't say I prefer it to the 70s one, but I wouldn't say it's worse either.
I wasn't really comparing it in my mind just because like they're not really related at all, apart from having the same title and being somewhat in the same genre as well.
I think that's the same style of film, but they're such different films.
I do think that both of them are worth watching. I think that both of them are kind of interesting in their own way. I think the Dead of Night 1940s version, it gives you a bit more to think about, and it's definitely a lot more like complicated. Like it's a movie that definitely asks you to like keep up with it and like pay attention to what's going on, but when you do think about it, it does actually become more interesting and even scarier, I would say. In fact, I'd recommend the 40s Dead of Night to not only fans of like classic horror and stuff, but if you're a David Lynch fan, then you definitely should watch this one.
Agreed.
Because it almost felt like, in terms of the setup and even the stuff that you were saying play out, almost felt like, the diner scene in Mulholland Drive, where he's describing that dream that he had.
Yes, yeah.
A feature-length version of that scene. And that's kind of how it plays out, in my opinion.
I think it's a fairly unique film, so it's a pretty interesting concept to go through. And you almost get to see precursors for other horror classics, which is really nice.
Any movie that's about like a ventriloquist doll or about a cursed mirror or even just like the standard like, you know, haunted house stories, you know, that's kind of like stuff like that is shown. Both me and Jack really like these ones, and yeah, we would both, as we said, we both recommend them. And next time we will be discussing a film by Nicholas Winding Refn called The Neon Demon.